Quite staggering numbers, shocking, but we all can attest to the reality of this as we feel the bite every day. Joining us this morning to assess Nigeria's economic landscape in 2023 is Segun Sopitan. He's the principal partner, Woodridge and Scott Consulting. Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right. I think you've heard the reports by Perpetual Fasomi Peter. We all have felt the effect of inflation. Are there hopes that it will get better in 2024? Do we expect it to get worse?
My feeling is that it will probably get worse and then begin to get better towards the end of the year. And I say this because economic policy generally has a lag time that you have to see between when the policies are enacted and when the impact is felt by the people on the streets. So, for example, if you talk about the subsidy removal, all other things being equal, the gains that we are supposed to see from that policy would have to do with government spending. And it will take time for the cash flows for subsidy savings to get into government coffers and get spread across the different tiers of government and all that, and then before citizens begin to feel the trickle-down effect. So before that happens, things will get worse. We probably will see inflation crossing the 30% threshold before we then begin to see it come down.
I mean, it's already crossed.
On food inflation, we're already well above 30%, but headline inflation is still 28.2. We will see headline inflation probably cross 30 before we begin to see it, begin to slow down a bit, hopefully. All of this depending on consistency of government policy in the things that needs to happen to ameliorate the effect of subsidy removal, and very critically in how the forex, the exchange rate is managed to ensure that it doesn't get worse, because at the moment it's getting worse. So if we're able to curtail the continued devaluation of the naira through very carefully implemented policies to attract supply and liquidity into the markets, then we may see that begin to slow down, and then we'll see improvements in terms of inflation, and that will eventually trickle down to the people.
Well, for me, I like practicality, and I like for us to really look at it from a practical angle. For every Nigerian, we're saying that they should expect an increase, the economy will get even worse. This is aligning with what the World Bank has said, that get ready Nigerians is going to be tougher. And the government, on the other hand, is saying, everybody tighten your seatbelts. What should the average Nigerian who's watching this morning now, at home, on the streets, walking, and possibly has his earphones plugged, what should they tighten their seatbelts on? Is it on the food, commodities, or better still, livelihood? Are we going to see more salaries being chopped off or chopped down? Are we going to see more layoff, sack, or you name it?
Well, for the average Nigerian listening to this conversation, I think the most important thing to understand is that things are going to get more expensive. Their salaries are not likely to increase. Therefore, you're going to have a reduction in their disposable income. So what can they do? It's either you increase the income side, or, very critically, if the income side is not under your control, reduce the expense side.
You have to cut down.
You've got to cut things down, and that's the tighten the belt thing. So, for example, if you're on GoTV or DSTV for your pay-per-view or satellite TV provider, you might want to consider dropping the bouquet that you're paying for.
How are they going to watch football?
They should go to viewing center.
So long as they don't subscribe to a bouquet that doesn't have DSTV 422.
Yes.
So long as, they have to have the bouquet that has DSTV 422 so they can watch it.
Absolutely.
The good thing is
I agree with you on that.
bouquet, so
absolutely. I think 422 is on almost all the bouquets, so they're covered. So if you're on premium, and I tell you, this affects even people that can afford premium. Premium is about 26,000 naira. Or 28,000 at the moment.
Personally, I paid yesterday, and I
felt
my
it.
fingers.
So when
you did some finger biting as the money was leaving. So if you are doing that, you probably want to come down to Compact Plus or something. And I'm being practical here. So if you're on GoTV, I don't know what the names of their own bouquets are. Go to the cheaper one. So you save some extra 2,000 or some extra 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever it is. if you used to switch on your generator to sleep, it's time to begin to think, do I want to get a rechargeable fan if you can't afford inverters? So simple practical steps like that, you have to. You don't have a choice. You have to implement them to reduce your costs, the cost of living generally, So it might even come down to food. And I know that some people are already doing that. Yeah, absolutely.
Not a lot of people are able to afford 3 square meals.
Absolutely,
as is.
absolutely.
And for those of us, I'm sure you would know if you were to check the number of help messages you've received from people who are looking for money. It's unending. And that's because people are suffering. People are going through a very rough time.
And in fact, the kind of people that those help messages are coming from is also shocking.
People that you think are doing well.
People that I think are very comfortable and are doing well, they've got good jobs, but they're overwhelmed because their income hasn't increased. And
but the expenditure is
serious pressure from the expense side all across board, So I think tighten the belt simply means, cut your costs.
But you've talked about cutting costs, and that's great. And I'm glad that you've made that very practical, because the average Nigerian needs to know, these terms, inflation and unification of exchange rate, all those things sound very foreign to the average person who's just trying to commute from house to the office or just trying to make ends meet and feed their family. Whilst we're cutting costs, how important is it for us to emphasize the need for the government to also cut the cost of running governance? Because we've seen a very bloated or maybe an over-bloated cabinet. So how very important is it for us to talk about the role that the government has to play? Or are we the only one that are going to be cutting down and the government won't cut down?
Well, the argument of the government is that the over-bloated, what we see as the excessive cost from the over-bloated cabinet is a necessary expenditure in order for them to unlock the capacity and the potential of the country.
Is it?
Well, that's the argument. I don't necessarily agree. So, for example, they've created a ministry called the Blue Economy Ministry. It's completely new. And the idea behind that is there is a wealth, a huge income stream, productivity in the ocean, marine, and all of that we need to harness. And that, the only way to do that is to create a ministry for that, rather than embedding that in some department, maybe in, transportation or, whatever other ministry, So that argument is there, and there is some merit to that. However, I would have thought that given the policies that government has implemented that has resulted in the hardship that we're seeing from Nigerians, even if only for optics and management of expectations and management of the feelings of Nigerians, those new ministries could have been created later. You could have taken some of these measures a year or even 2 into your administration. Start off by leading by example with the people in terms of costs, cost of governance and all that.
And even maybe looking at the last cabinet, because when we talk about our cabinet, one thing that we don't really understand is the KPI. What are we looking at? How do we access, how well a particular government has fared? The last cabinet, how well can we say they fared? What are the things that we're looking out for? So I think that's one step we don't really consider. We're appointing new people, creating new ministries, but we're not looking at what has been, the mistakes that have been done before and saying, okay, how can we do this differently from the people before?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that this administration, to their credit, created one office, performance tracking, something, and gave that role to, I think, Zainab Usman, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's actually potentially, if it works, a brilliant idea, because it addresses this point you make. So,
I like the word you use, if it works.
I always say if and potentially, just to be safe.
Because some things might look true to the books,
yeah,
while some other things might just be aesthetics.
Yeah, absolutely.
That this would actually happen.
Absolutely.
But still talking about the economy, what is really weakening Nigeria's economic fundamentals? What's really weakening it to the point that it's never been this bad? Let's be honest. Now, many are hinging the blame on the oil prices, the global oil prices, which of course, we could look at it and say, okay, a bit sentimental or not. While some people are still saying that aside from the oil prices, they're also going to look at the fact that the past previous government had spent so much that cannot be accounted for. But what really are the things weakening the fundamentals of Nigeria's economy?
I think the biggest problem we have at the moment as a country, and that we've had for a long time, is poor policy formulation and almost zero implementation. which speaks to the governance questions. I mean, you can blame oil prices, you can blame all the various fundamentals that are happening, the global fundamentals that are really not in your control. But look, these things are not happening to only you. They happen to other economies, they happen to other countries, and they find their way through those things with relative, I won't say with ease, but they find a way. So for example, the COVID-19 pandemic came with all of the logistic and transportation disruptions and all of that. Then the Ukraine-Russia war came, and the same thing, the thing got exacerbated, and inflation almost went out of control. Last year, we saw inflation crossing into double digits in the United States and some other advanced economies for the first time in many decades. But guess what? This year, they're already back to saying, in fact, the United States is back to, I think, 4% or thereabouts, 5%. The UK, the same thing. They've tempered these things. In Nigeria, inflation is moving in the opposite direction, purely on the back of poor policy implementation, formulation and implementation. So for example, here you are as a country already battling with, the result of, oil price reduction, global logistics disruption and all of that. And it's in that moment that you've now decided to devalue your currency. It's in that moment you've decided to remove subsidies. The timing is horrible. And you obviously, from the outcome that we're now seeing, didn't even plan, didn't have a clear contingency to deal with the impact of these policies.
But was he really to blame? Was this current administration really to blame when it comes to the subsidy conversation? Because we already knew that subsidy was going to end from the current administration. They were no longer going to fund it from June, I believe. So I don't know if they are completely to blame.
100% to blame.
Okay, tell me about it.
Yeah, because the subsidy is a line item in the budget, right? So if the old administration says, think about it, they kicked the can down the road. And Buhari, we say that he wasn't very smart and what have you, but look, the guy is very smart. He kicked the can down the road. He knew that this thing probably needed to happen. He'd been told repeatedly that it needed to happen. He refused, flat refusal for years and years. And then when he sees that he's about to leave, then he removes subsidy effective July 1. Effective July 1, no subsidies anymore. Now, it's a line item in the budget. Why did Buhari refuse to remove it while he was president? Because he knew the dislocations and what it would do to an already impoverished population. So if the president, this current president, wanted to keep it, it was just a simple supplementary budget to the National Assembly and subsidy would have been maintained.
Fair enough.
So for me, the excuse that, we didn't do this, it was the previous administration, it's not true. The president saw this and simply, and let's not forget it's the same APC. So I think that this was already planned.
A continuation.
It was just a continuation.
I also want to piggyback off something you said. You mentioned that part of what has led us where we are is poor policy implementation and execution. Would you say that the unification of the exchange rates was also one of the poor policies that was implemented by this administration?
100%. I think it's something that probably needs to happen, right? But for me, the problem is, so the policy itself is not bad. The problem is the implementation timing and the implementation process. Now, you have unified, supposedly, the exchange rates. Well, there are two things that has happened there. The multiple official rates have gone. So we have only one official rate, and that's fantastic. But you now have the same, if not worse, gap between the official rates and the parallel market rates. So we've achieved nothing in that regard. In implementing that policy, it was important that the government had dealt with the issue of liquidity and supply. Because if you did not, then the only thing that would happen when you do your managed float policy is that the naira will float upwards. It was never going to come down because the supply was not matching the demand. This is simple, basic economics. And I know that the people that are implementing these things know this. I don't think there's an incompetence problem, so I wonder what the problem is. And I've always argued, very simple. Yes, you cannot deal with the export problem, that would address the supply issue. But there are other sources of liquidity outside of export proceeds. You've got remittances. You've got, I can list them. And all you need to do is to develop an intricate, I don't even want to use the word intricate, just develop a policy framework that would attract and ramp up those other sources of supply, pending when you can deal with the export problem. But we didn't do that. And that's why we're where we are. So it's a policy problem.
We have a lot to talk about, most importantly, whenever we engage in this conversation, and time is always my worry. But then again, we could look at, we could look at taxation, how it's impacting on the economy recently. We did see how taxes were being said they would actually, lay low so that companies could at least breathe going towards 2024, ending of 2023. But let's look at what the DMO office has said, the Debt Management Office. They said that Nigeria is owing about 87.91 trillion naira in debt. And in few weeks' time, if not months, the presidency will be borrowing again. Let's look at the aspect of borrowing, even while in debt. When asked, some economists would say America is always picked as the point of focus, that they are the highest borrowers in the world. In this time that Nigerians find themselves, is borrowing the answer? And will our debt profile keep increasing? Is it going to in any way have a detrimental effect to ruining the economy further?
It's a difficult problem. It's almost like a devil and the deep blue sea situation. And I say that because, on the one hand, the revenue profile of our government is clearly too low. It's the worst in the world, bar countries that are at war. Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, I counted about 4. Outside of those 4 countries, Nigeria's revenue to GDP is the worst. Tax to GDP is the worst, about 4% in the world. So it's a big problem. And it's a problem that successive administrations have not been able to address because of our poor tax administration situation as a country as a whole. But on the other hand, how do you ramp up government revenues without furthering impoverishing the people, without making cost of governance higher, and all that? So I don't envy the government, and that's why I always talk about, perhaps the go-to solution in all of this is first to deal with corruption and revenue leakages, because they are tremendous. Even, look, I always say this on air. I challenge any Nigerian, just go and check the Auditor General's report, 2021. Auditor General of the Federation. Just check the report. They churn out these beautiful reports year after year. It's loaded with a can of worms in terms of revenues that just disappear. And it's documented, and yet nothing happens. So I think maybe one of the first, for me, the lowest hanging fruit would have been to deal with these revenue leakages, to deal with corruption, to deal with, these agencies and parastatals that simply refuse to remit without consequences. And then, while you're doing that, which would significantly, I dare say, improve government revenues, then begin to look at how you can formulate your tax policies to punish, in quotes, the rich, whilst you are protecting the poor. That's what all developed economies do. So you have a very wide tax band for private individuals and for corporates.
I just want to quickly chip in.
Excuse me.
You've mentioned that they need to target companies that are probably not remitting, and you've mentioned some other measures. Would you say that the NNPC has a role in all of this?
The NNPC is one of the biggest problems. The NNPC is one of the biggest problems of this country. In terms of transparency of its operations, in terms of remittance of revenues, and all of that.
And what can be done? What can be done about it? I mean, whilst Lamido Sanusi has been calling for the transparency of NNPC, and it's been years, nothing really has been done. So what can be done about it? What should be done? And will anything really be done about it?
Look, the courage that the president has demonstrated, the very much vaunted and taunted courage of the president, I really wish he would direct it and laser focus it at the institution called the NNPC. If we do that, you will see how things will significantly change. Do you know, I kept saying, the president went to Saudi Arabia recently for the Saudi Africa Summit. And I kept thinking, can the president please visit Aramco's national operating center, the network, the national center of Aramco? I've seen the video, and I'm sure you guys probably would have happened across that video. It's a huge room, almost circular like this studio, and it's got TV screens, circular. And the minister was boasting, he was boastful about it, that not a single drop of oil that comes out of the ground of Saudi Arabia is not accounted for. They know exactly to the last liter how much oil is drilled from the ground, and they know exactly to the last dollar what has happened to it and where the revenues are. If we're able to do that with the NNPC, trust me, our revenue problems they won't disappear, but they will significantly improve. The opacity in the NNPC is a problem, and it's not a difficult problem to solve. Unfortunately, it's a corruption-related problem. Does the president have the will to face it? The answer is in the wind. I have no answers to that.
Mr. Shokweton, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a delight to have conversations with you. We will continue these conversations on social media. We urge you to tweet at News Central TV to share your thoughts as well.